Okay, now I'm going to send you back. Okay.
We ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, my name is Bob Payne. I'm a licensed geologist for the state of North Carolina, and we started this company about 28 years ago. And residential heating oil tanks is pretty much all we do. So we've seen and done just about everything. So what I'm going to try to do is relay some of our experience to you guys so that y'all can be the experts and know how best to advise your clients when dealing with it, whether you're listing a house or approaching a client as a buyer's agent. So residential heating oil tanks, both underground and above ground storage tanks is what we're going to be talking about. And I'm going to be able to do it with this. Mm-hmm. All right, can y'all see what's on the screen?
Yes.
Have any idea what you're looking at? That is a close-up shot of the bottom side of this oil tank. These oil tanks were typically installed when homes were built back in the 50s and early 60s. And they don't last but about 20 to 30 years on average. So most of the ones that we're looking at are approaching 60 or more years old now, and they all look like that. So note that if you're going to be listing or representing a buyer for a property of that age, that vintage, even if there's no evidence of an underground oil tank, know that it likely had oil in the past as a heat source, and then it's just a matter of putting all the puzzle pieces together, and that's what we do. So for underground storage tanks, we're going to go over what to look for. So when you're doing your walkthrough, you can see what visible signs on the outside and on the inside. And if you're real aggressive and you actually get in the crawl space, which some of you guys will do, you'll know what to look for. Typically, what you're going to hear property owner say in their defense of why it's probably not an issue and what options are available given site conditions. That may include filing a notice of residual petroleum with the County Register of Deeds office. It could be an in-place abandonment of the tank where we're cleaning it out and filling it with a structurally supported material. Or it could be the more aggressive approach, which is the actual removal of the tank and any associated contaminated soil. And we're going to talk about how much time all this takes. So as far as what to look for, as I said earlier, if a house was built in the mid-60s or earlier, it likely had oil heat. If it was built in the 30s or 20s, it would have started with coal heat and then converted over to oil in the 40s or 50s. Obvious signs on the outside, if you're just walking around the house, are a fill and vent pipe. The fill pipe is to the right and the vent pipe is to the left. This may be underneath a row of azaleas up against the house. Typically, they're within 5 or so feet of the foundation. They're not usually out in the middle of the yard. People don't want to mow around them, so they will, if the tank itself is installed in the middle of the yard, they'll elbow the pipes underground and have them come up in landscaping where they're often hidden over the years, just so they don't have to deal with them. So there's your one, the fill pipe on the right and vent on the left. Sometimes people are building decks or sunrooms over top of them, in which case we have to deal with that. So you can see those are being kind of hidden up underneath there, or a room addition. So here's somebody built an actual room over top of it, and the tank's still there, never been dealt with. So we're having to look in basements and or crawl spaces as part of our inspection to help put all these puzzle pieces together to figure out the big story. Copper lines, typically if you're going to walk through the basement, you may see a pair of copper tubing coming through a foundation wall that's been crimped or just severed like this. One is a supply line and the other is a return line for the unspent fuel leading back from the furnace to the tank. Almost always a pair of lines. They may still have an inline oil filter attached, such as this. And in a rarer case, they are almost invisible to see, but here's one where they've been cut and crimped and then painted over. Y'all see them? I'll just try to do this here. These right here. Those are the oil lines. You see them? Okay. And now we got to get that off of there. Okay. All right. Above-ground oil tanks, we deal with those also. A lot of times they are installed as replacement tanks. That's typical if the house is larger than 1,300 square feet. In this case, you can see an oil tank sitting on the back side of the house. And you can also see, if I can do this right, there's your fill and vent pipes right here. So if you ever see that situation, you know that you have a leaking oil tank, underground oil tank, and that you're probably going to be dealing with contaminated soils.
No, ours was smaller than 1,000 square feet, so that was enough to fill for you.
I can barely hear you. What was the question? No question. Can y'all hear me okay?
I can hear you.
You can hear me?
Yes, I just think some of our microphones are not muted.
Okay, everybody okay? All right. This is an above ground oil tank. And the reason why I have this picture, it's actually a replacement tank for a leaking oil tank in the front yard. But the thing I wanted to show you on this case is that when you see that wetness on the bottom of the tank, that is not water, that is oil. So when you see that, you know you've got a leaking above ground oil tank. In this case, the homeowner thought they would just put a plastic diaper underneath it to catch the oil, which was not the thing to do. They should have called somebody to have the oil removed. This is an oil tank that's been leaking in somebody's basement. They stopped using the oil, they crimped the line, but over the years, you just had a slow, steady drip and it made quite a mess. You don't want to see that. This is a proper install and proper care of an above ground tank in a crawl space. It's well off the ground. It's not in contact with soil. If that oil tank contacts the soil, you're likely going to have leakage in the years to come. So this is a good example of an oil tank that's in good shape. Here is a picture of the side of an above ground oil tank that has hooked onto pre-existing oil lines from a leaking underground oil tank. You can see the difference in the patina of the oil lines. So here's the new oil lines here, right there and there. And you see how these have a different patina. That's telling you that it replaced an underground oil tank. There was no visible evidence of the underground oil tank in this case. They removed the fill and vent pipes from the ground surface, but we located it with a metal detector. So that's one of the things we do during our inspection. And the reason why they have to replace the underground oil tanks once they begin to leak is that they will oftentimes collect water. Water will come into the tank, collect on the bottom of on the inside of the tank, and it'll start sucking water instead of fuel. That fouls the furnace. The oil companies know what that's all about. And instead of dealing with the underground oil tank, all they want to do is sell oil. So they're going to offer the homeowner the option and quick fix of installing an above ground oil tank. And then everybody forgets about the underground oil tank and it continues to leak over the years. So what to look for? a house built before mid-60s, you can have oil tanks or houses built in the 70s, but most of them are before mid-60s. Look for your fill and vent pipes when you're doing your walk around. The copper oil lines, if you're looking in a basement, I really don't expect you to do a belly crawl and do an inspection in the crawl space, but that's what we have to do to locate these oil lines. If we're going to deal with removing the oil in the oil lines, we have to know what the oil lines are doing, whether they're crimped or not, so that we can put a vacuum on them and remove the residual oil, and also to check for any leakage that might have happened. Look for above ground oil tanks. Do they look out of place for the neighborhood? And also look for ground depression. Sometimes people will remove the oil tank and think that that's all they needed to do. But that is not the case, because they may have left all the soil contamination, and that's what's regulated. The tanks themselves are not regulated, just the soils that are regulated. In this case, there's a ground depression that I will show you here. It's right here. Y'all see that? There's a little puddle of water right here. Right here is the vent pipe that was never removed from the tank system. So in that case, I would go out there and do a soil boring during the inspection. And usually when I get down about 4 and 5 feet from ground surface, I'm going to hit soil contamination. So even though we don't see any evidence of an oil tank, there's things that you do that we have learned to do further investigation to make sure that there really isn't one. So a lot of times we will hear one-liners from homeowners about what they think is going on with their oil tank. And basically these are things that are said to try to get somebody to believe that it's not an issue. So they may say, well, I haven't used the tank in years. I don't know what that's supposed to mean, but they say it and it's supposed to get somebody's mind off of the tank. Or I had the tank drained years ago so that it shouldn't be an issue. Or I'm still using my tank and I've had no problems. Well, I'm going to show you an example of that, that's not what you go by. You go by the age of the tank, so, or the age of the house actually. So if it's 1965 house, that tank's already approaching 60 years old. It only lasts 20 to 30 as a general rule of thumb. They may say we've never seen any evidence of leakage. Typically you wouldn't. It's going to be happening on the bottom side of the tank, several feet in the ground. Or I had the tank abandoned years ago. All right, well, what do they mean by abandoned years ago? Do they buy a bag of play sand at Lowe's and put it down the fill pipe, or they just stop using it? Did they have it drained? Do they have any documentation to support what was really done? And typically when you hear all these one-liners, there is no documentation that exists. Or I had the tank removed years ago. I'm going to show you an example of that, to where that does not hold any weight if that's all you're going by. Or I don't have an underground tank, I have an above ground tank. Well, as you've already seen, that may be a replacement tank. And people may honestly not know what's going on. They just may be hearing what Uncle Fred said, or the previous owner, that it's something was done, but they really don't know that anything was done, but they're just repeating what they've been told. Oftentimes they're not the original owners anymore. This property may have been recycled through a variety of owners. So ultimately what I'm getting at is, where's the documentation to show that this has been resolved or it's no longer an issue? 99 times out of 100, you're not going to get any documentation presented to you. Here it is an example of an oil tank that was abandoned years ago. All they did was do the Lowe's trip and throw a couple bags of play sand. They didn't clean the tank. They didn't fill the tank. They just threw a couple of bags of sand down the fill pipe and called it good. Well, now we have a bunch of oily sand we have to get out as part of cleaning out the tank to do it right. Here's the tank that has been foamed. Now you may have been, might be familiar with tanks that have been foamed. That's about one of the worst things you can do to a tank. And the reason is, It will shrink over time. It's not structurally supportive. And the people that do it typically do not clean the tank. They may claim to clean it, but you will not see any photographic documentation to prove that it was properly cleaned. And there is no physical way to clean a tank unless you cut it open. So in this case, this was a 1,000-gallon tank that we removed 600 gallons of fluid out of. And you can see the foam was stuck to the top of the tank, but once we removed the fluid, everything shrank. So that is not structurally supportive. And that can be an issue when that tank starts to collapse, which it will over time. Here's another one that has been foamed. So it was not cleaned. And yes, the foam has shrunk to about 1/3 of its size. That's typical. So foam is not the product used. This is one where they use clay, which would have been okay to use. It would have been structurally supportive, but they only cut a hole in one end of the tank and not the other. So 2/3 of the tank was still empty and filled with fluid. So that is not the way to do it. You want to use a material that will fill up 100% of the tank, is structurally supportive. You want to be able to document that the tank has been cleaned down to bare metal with photographic supporting evidence. That's the proper way to do it. Here's one that is showing the tank is in the process of collapsing. So you can see the roof is already starting to cave in. That's why you want something structurally supportive. This is a tank that was removed. It was actively in use. Yes, they were losing quite a bit of oil while they were using it. The reason why they did not know there was a problem is because the pit that was dug to install the tank did not hold water. A lot of times you'll make a bathtub effect when you dig a pit to install a tank, and it'll hold water, and water gets in the tank, and that's what alerts somebody into the fact that they have a leaking oil tank. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes you have a pit that has a porous bottom and it doesn't hold water. In such case, you're going to rust out the tank anyways, and then the oil leaves the tank and no water comes in. And as far as the oil company goes, is concerned, there's not a problem. Let's keep putting oil in this tank, even though it's 60 years old. Well, in this case, you could have put a baseball through the bottom of the tank. It was leaking quite a bit of oil, and the property was so contaminated, they could not sell it. So just because somebody says, I'm still using my tank, I've had no problems, that's not good enough. You've got to investigate the soils underneath that tank. All residential heating oil tanks are non-regulated, but as I said earlier, the soils are the issue. That's what the state regulates, the soils and the groundwater. So that needs to be the focus, not just the tank. It's what the tanks are doing to the environment. So how do you deal with this? Well, your first step is to have a licensed geologist come out, such as myself, and do an inspection. What we're trying to find or establish during our inspection is, one, are there any underground oil tanks? Sometimes there's more than one. We use a metal detector to survey around the perimeter of the house to locate any tanks that are there. If they're there, we will find them. If they're within 3 feet of surface, which they typically are, usually they're about 18 inches down. And we will look at all of those tanks. We want to know if there's any soil contamination. So we're doing soil borings. Once we have located the tank, and we'll put white flags in the ground marking the ends, then we'll do vertical borings around that tank, starting at the ends of the tank, to determine if there's any soil contamination. We want to go in the basement and or crawl space. So we'll need access to an open crawl space, or someone's going to have to open up the house to let us get into the basement. We're looking for the oil lines. Are they crimped? Have they leaked? Is there any oil staining coming through a foundation wall? All of these things are part of our inspection for identifying any problems that could possibly affect your buyer. What is the risk classification? That's going to determine what options are available to the current property owner as to how they even can approach the oil tank if there is an environmental issue. Risk classification primarily is determined by the presence or absence of water supply wells, active or inactive. they can be hooked up to city water. But if that house started with well water, and many have, they're now hooked up to city water. If there is a well, active or inactive, within 150 feet of a leaking petroleum underground storage tank, then the risk classification would be considered high risk. In such case, the state will require the most aggressive approach, which is the removal of the tank and the contaminated soils. That is a much more expensive proposition than simply abandoning the tank. So we try to not have to do that whenever possible. And you can do that by simply abandoning any existing wells that are within 150 feet by a certified well driller and generating what's called a well abandonment record. If the well is still in use and that is their sole source of water, then they may have to drill a new well farther than 150 feet. And if they can't, then they're going to have to be digging up that tank and soils and hope that they can get it all cleaned up. If they can't, they will never get a clearance letter from the state, which can be a problem. So it's a big deal. So hopefully you can get a low risk classification. Well, we address that in our report. Are there any health risks that can also affect risk classification? Primarily, the health risk is going to be, has a well been impacted, or is there any soil, oil contamination coming through a porous masonry wall, like in a basement, and posing what's called a vapor intrusion issue? You do not want to smell this stuff. It is carcinogenic. It becomes a health issue. If the state will classify the property as high risk. What are the legal requirements that the property owner must deal with prior to conveyance of the property? We list that in our inspection report. And then what options are available for resolving the issue? And you may have more than one option. You might have the option of both abandonment or removal of the tank. But usually you're going to be looking at a tank abandonment in most cases. But we discuss that and we price that out in our inspection report. So you get a lot for your inspection report. For the Salisbury area, you're looking at an inspection cost of $400. If it's Asheville, it's going to be $700 just because it's going to take all day to get there and back. So, but for the Salisbury area, you're looking at $400 for the inspection report, and you get all of this documentation to let you know exactly how to proceed from that point on. Once a release has been discovered, by law, it must be reported to the state. That is typically done by issuance of what's called a UST 61 form. We will not do that unless asked to do that by the property owner. It is their responsibility, not mine, to report it. Once we are given the approval to report it, we will do so. At times, a property owner doesn't want to report it, and the buyer may be the one to report it. They can ask me to report it, and I will do it on their behalf to represent them. But ultimately, it's the property owner's responsibility to report that. If it's low risk and there's no water supply wells, then the state will issue what's called a conditional notice of no further action letter once they know that it's low risk, and they get that from the UST 61 form, and they have approved a notice of residual petroleum. That notice of residual petroleum will have restrictions. I'll show you that in a second. Also note that the Department of Environmental Quality will not issue their clearance letter. It's called a Notice of No Further Action, or NFA letter, for high-risk properties unless everything is cleaned up. So that's another reason why you want to try to reclassify, if you can, to low risk. The state will also want to abate the release. That's either going to be by properly cleaning and abandoning the underground tank so that things don't get any worse, or you're going to be looking at removing the tank and the contaminated soils. They're going to require something be done so that things don't get worse. They want to make sure that does not happen, because things can get worse. So And then finally, file a notice of residual petroleum with the county register of deeds office. That is required prior to conveyance of a property that has known soil contamination. Once the conditional notice of no further action letter has been issued, there's a step called public notification where that letter, along with a letter of explanation, has been sent by certified mail to adjacent property owners, city and county managers, and county public health director. We get the receipts back from that and forward the receipts to the Department of Environmental Quality, and they will ultimately issue the final notice of no further action letter. And at that point, you're done. This is an example of a notice of residual petroleum. It's a several-page document. Basically, it's just identifying the property owner, a legal description, the land use restrictions. Basically, do not disturb where the soil contamination is. It's not a health risk if you don't disturb it. If you expose yourself to it, it is a health risk. So they say don't disturb it. Normally, that's an area of about 3 feet surrounding the estimated extent of the soil contamination. You will not be able to put a confined airspace over top of that area. So if they want to put a room addition, you will not be able to do that. If they want to put a room addition, the buyer will then say, I cannot accept this. You're going to have to dig up that tank and try to remove the soils. In most cases, a buyer can deal with it because that area is not going to be disturbed anyway, but you have to consider that. Groundwater, you will not be able to install or operate a water supply well. So those are your land use restrictions. And then we generate, and it has to be notarized by both me or the consultant and the incident manager right there. And then we generate a figure, and that shows where the land use restriction is, the little stippled pattern. So that's a notice of residual petroleum. That may be acceptable to some, but you have to make sure that it is acceptable to lenders. At times, they may require more than what the state requires. Homeowners insurance providers, some require that you deal with the tank, others don't care, but they need to be made aware of what's going on. And then buyers, even though they need to be concerned about it because they may require more than what the state is requiring. And things can get worse over time. So lenders, depending on the loan program, they may require you to remove a tank when the state might not, especially if you're doing government-sponsored loan programs. Homeowners insurance providers, some, as I said, some will cover it, some won't. Most have what they call a pollution exclusion clause, and they're not going to be liable for any contamination, but their viewpoint is they don't want to get dragged into court. Even though they won't be held liable, it costs time and money to be dragged into court, so they stay away from it. For buyers, they need to be concerned because a leaking tank, if it's not an issue now, may become an issue on their watch. In this case, all this black on the inside of this basement retaining wall, that is oil leaching through the ground and impacting the cinder block, and those cinder blocks act like sponges. They hold oil and then it works its way through, and now you're smelling it on the inside of your house, and it's very difficult to get rid of at that point. So you don't want to leave a leaking oil tank up against the house. You want to get that taken care of before it becomes an issue. Here's somebody that wanted to put a room addition and they found an oil tank within the footprint of their footer. That all had to be removed. The state would not allow that for them to proceed. So in that case, they had to dig up the tank in the soils. And leaving oil in a tank is just an accident waiting to happen. In this case, you had a big rain event, which we seem to get a lot of those lately. If water gets in that tank, it'll float oil out the top of the tank through the fill or vent pipe, in which in this case, the fill pipe was right at the land surface, right here. oil was pushed out. It kills grass on contact. It went down across the yard and on out through the neighborhood. You don't want that to happen. So again, to leave these tanks in place and doing nothing is just begging for further problems. For a tank that was previously removed, we talked about that. I had my tank removed years ago, so that shouldn't be a problem. Well, here's a case where it was a big problem. The lady said she had the tank removed and she's got an above ground tank that we're seeing. Well, that's that red flag I was talking about. That's probably a replacement tank. She did confirm that there was an underground tank out in the middle of the yard. We looked in the crawl space and here's 2 sets of oil lines. That's telling us, yes, there was another oil tank. She was told 20 years before by the person who removed the tank that the tank hadn't leaked. And that's all the documentation she had was what that guy said. So my buyer, we were representing the buyer, he said, I'm not happy with filing a notice of residual petroleum. We want to dig it up. Oh, well, let me get back to it. I'm jumping out. We didn't know where that oil tank was. So we hooked on our metal detector to the oil lines and traced it out to the middle of the yard where we found contamination 5 feet down. So at that point, the property, it was a low risk site. So the state wasn't requiring that any excavation be done. They wanted a notice of residual petroleum and they'd be good with it. The property owner did not want, the buyer did not want that. He didn't want the land use restrictions. So they agreed, him and the seller, that she would clean it up. Well, so that's what we did. We start digging and we kept digging and we kept digging, and 400 tons later, which came to about $60,000, we cleaned it up, but that came out of closing. So in this case, the lady had no documentation there was an underground oil tank. She said it was removed, but it cost her $60,000 at closing. Look for that documentation that it's no longer an issue. In place abandonment. Here we have a site. Tank was kind of difficult to get to. It's located right here underneath this HVAC unit. We could not get a cement truck to it. So these orange flags are marking the ends of the tank. So we excavate down to the top of the tank where we can cut it open, which we do. And we see the oil that's still in the tank. We take a picture of it once we pressure wash the interior where it's cleaned down to bare metal to prove that it was properly cleaned. We put a vacuum in the oil lines to remove any oil that's in the oil lines. And in this case, with an extra little addition to the chute to the cement truck, we were able to reach it. We're filling it with what's called an excavatable flowable fill cement slurry. That is the material you want to put in the tank. We photograph each step of the process here that we can show that the tank was 100% filled with this material. It'll set up like a very stiff soil overnight. We then put everything back, and that's what it looks like after we're done. We try to make it look just like it did before we got there when it's all said and done. But there's a series of 6 photographs in our abandonment report, a before and after picture, a picture of the tank cut open, showing the interior of the tank before we clean it, picture of the tank cleaned, picture of the filling process, and a picture of the tank 100% filled before we put everything back. That's called documentation to show that it's been properly dealt with. Here is an oil tank example that was foamed. This one's down in Charlotte. It's right against the foundation. The tank is not structurally supportive. We cut the tank open. You can see where the foam was stuck to the top side of the tank, but it shrinks. It just doesn't work. So here we are sucking out the fluid, and you can see you can just stab right through the foam. It's very soft. So once we have removed the fluid, that's what was left of the foam. So it shrank down next to nothing. And you can see they did not clean the tank. All that brown stuff is oil stain on the foam. So somebody's got to get down in there and clean that. And that's what it looks like after we've cleaned it. We document that we clean it, and then we are filling it with the structurally supportive cement slurry. And we're documenting that all that's been done. That's how to do it right. Sometimes you have to remove an oil tank. In this case, this was a high-risk site for a number of reasons. One, they had a water supply well, and two, it was leaking in the basement. The wife was telling her husband that she was smelling oil. Women can smell oil apparently a little bit better than men. The husband said that he didn't smell anything, so he didn't do anything. They were actively using this tank, still putting oil in it. We do our inspection, and what we find is this discolored grayish brown soil, strong odor of oil. It was obviously leaking. And again, this was an active tank. This is what it was doing to the basement. All of this stuff here, that is all oil stained, and they were getting, it was very strong when I went down to the basement. I don't know how they even could live in it. But it's caused quite a bit of a problem. There's no way to clean it up at that point. We removed the tank. There's the little holes in the tank right here. Okay, that I'm pointing to. And now here is the excavation pit. And you can see the oil has stained all of this red soil bluish gray. Okay, now I'm going to do a close-up right in here. And what you're seeing is oil that had leaked out of the tank, found this French drain. This is terracotta pipe right here. Found the French drain. The oil went into the French drain, wrapped around the house. So the whole house had oil in it. There's no way to clean it up. You'd have to tear the house down. We could not excavate any farther than that because it just wouldn't make any difference. It was just contamination all the way around the house. It was a sad situation. Here we're putting oil dry all up against the foundation wall. And you see it's stained from here all the way to here. And you're putting fans trying to ventilate the basement. There's no way to clean it up. It was just, there's too much damage done. And on top of that, they had a sump pump in the basement. And guess what it was pumping out into the yard? The oil that was leaking into the basement. So they were just spreading it around everywhere. That's about as worst case situation as you're ever going to find. And you hopefully will not encounter one. Above ground, this is an above ground tank that's in a tight crawl space, which is okay, but you see that it's in contact with wet ground. That's just a recipe for a leaking oil tank situation. So here we are. That's me doing my belly crawl, trying to cut this thing out. Since they installed the tank, they typically install them when they build the house, and they build the house around the tank in a case like this. Now you're putting duct work and everything around the tank. You can't physically remove it unless you cut it up into a bunch of little pieces. So that's what I'm having to do in this case to remove the tank. There's actually a picture of the inside of the tank. We actually had to crawl inside this tank and cut it from the inside out. And if you see a bone dry tank like that, that's telling you that everything leaked out years before. The only way you're going to get a dry tank is if it leaked out. Here's a picture of the holes that were on the bottom slab of that tank. Fortunately for these people, more than 10% of the tank was below grade, and the state classifies an underground storage tank. In such case, they did not require removal of the contaminated soils, but they did require a notice of residual petroleum. Had it been just less than 10% below grade, they would have required a hand excavation of all the contaminated soil, because they treat above ground tank releases different from underground oil tank releases. Something to consider. In this case, we had to hand dig a leak from an above ground oil tank where it leaked at the furnace connection. We hand excavated over 30 tons underneath this house. So this guy's standing at the bottom of the excavation pit. State required it. You had to do it. That got expensive too. Timeline, usually from start to finish, we can deal with things in less than a month, depending on the severity of the situation. Inspections are usually in 24 hours of request. So we can, even if we're real busy, we can usually fit an inspection in at some point. But just know that we might need access to the basement, so we'll have to coordinate with a realtor or get an access code. Abandonment, we can usually do within a week of approval or removal. Paperwork, we can do it in a couple of days, especially now since because of COVID, the state has allowed us to do a lot of emailing or what do you call it? E-recording. So we don't have to actually go to the Register of Deeds office to file a document. We can do it online. And the regional supervisors, one can sign for another one. So we can email the NRPs to the incident managers, get their approval, and then from there, it can take, it's pretty quick. But there's other paperwork. The public notice usually takes a couple of weeks. We have to wait on the issuance of the conditional notice of no further action letter from the state. They may be busy. It may take them a week or more to get to that. Even though they have everything they need to write it, it may take them a while. They're busy people, and especially with COVID, everybody's working still out of their homes and not in the office. So that could take weeks. And then once you send out the public notification notices, that's going to take a couple of weeks to get all the receipts back, get to the state so they can then issue the final notice of no further action letter. So you want to get this paperwork dealt with as soon as possible, hopefully before you list the property. But if you're representing the buyer, it may postpone a closing. The sooner you can deal with this end of it, the better, so that it doesn't eat up your time or postpone a closing. So let me know if you have a closing date. We try to move things along as quick as possible so that we don't have to postpone a closing. The quicker we can get in and do things, the faster we can get out. And again, like I just said, if you're representing a seller, encourage them to deal with it before you list the property, because it does take a little bit of time. And your time is valuable. So don't let it eat up your time and deal with this as a last minute thing. Unfortunately, it happens to be a last minute thing sometimes because the owner may not know anything about an oil tank. And as part of due diligence, the buyer goes in there, we find an oil tank, and all of a sudden you got a bunch of stuff to deal with. So at that point, you're going to probably have to postpone closing unless you're a month or two out. So things to remember, know what properties are likely to have used oil heat in the past, 1960s or earlier. Know your obvious signs, such as the oil lines or the fill and vent pipes sticking up. Know that it's usually easy to get a final notice of no further action letter, but you're going to have to take a few steps, and it's likely going to involve filing a notice of residual petroleum with land use restrictions. And know what a proper in-place abandonment of an underground oil tank consists of. And that's usually over removal. And again, our goal is to provide or generate the best documentation we know how to do, so that a buyer has the best documentation to present future buyers, so that everybody's concerns have been addressed and everybody's fears are put at ease. And you know what time requirements are. We went over that. I am available for questions that if you may have any. And I'm not hearing anything, so I don't know if this is even working.
We can hear you.
Okay.
I don't, maybe we don't have questions. I don't know. I think you did a pretty thorough job. Very insightful.
Well, just know that I'd say that 90% of the tanks that we look at, we're having to deal with the environmental issue. 9 times out of 10, because usually they're over 50 years old and they simply on average don't last more than 20 to 30 years. And even if the property owner says, no, I don't have an oil tank, but my house was built in 1955 and it's a 1,600 square foot home, it had oil heat. So where's the documentation to put that issue to rest? And it could be I go out and I do an inspection and I don't find anything. Well, then you're left with a report that says we looked, we didn't find anything, end of story. Now you've got a piece of documentation that addresses the issue and it's a done deal. So even if we don't find anything, that report's worth every dollar that you spent for it.
Right.
A lot of times though, when the property owner doesn't know they have anything and we do our due diligence, we are finding things. So either way, it's pretty valuable to have that initial inspection. And I would put us as one of the initial inspections. Don't wait till we're the very last thing and they've already done appraisals and this is and that's is and the buyer spent all this money and then we find this big problem. That's not going to go over well.
Right.
But
I think it's good even for peace of mind for the buyer.
oh yeah, for peace of mind, because I mean, and we get that a lot actually. So, but yeah, 1960s or earlier, it's a good idea to have that inspection done.
Can we have any
I'm available. You can call me at any time. Go to our website. We have a little contact submission form. Website is cedarrockenvironmental.com. There's a lot of useful information on there. And I am available anytime. You can call me on my cell phone, which I don't know if y'all have that information. But if you want to write it down, it's 336-684-2734. And if you have a question or if you have a suspicious pipe in the yard and you don't know what it is, send me a picture of it. I'll tell you what I think it is or whether, oh, that's just a sewer clean out. You don't need me. And don't call me for propane tanks. Propane tanks are not an issue. They pose no environmental concerns. Gasoline, oil, yes, need to call somebody, but don't. Propane, if it leaks, it just gases off. It doesn't hurt the soils or groundwater, it just gases off.
Sounds good. Does anybody have any questions?
Yes, I would like to have an idea of prices of different stage, like the inspection, how much would that be?
Inspection is going to, if it's in the Salisbury Concord area, you're looking at $400. If you are dealing with a tank abandonment, of course, it's going to depend on the size of the tank, access to the tank, burial depth, but typically you're in the low 3,000 range, plus $1.25 per gallon of whatever we have to pump out of that tank to get it clean, which will be what's in it now. Add about 30 gallons for the pressurized rinsate water to remove the oily sludge that's stuck on the bottom half of that tank. If you're dealing with a tank and soil removal, you can start at about $1,000. And that covers the analyticals the state requires, the first 15 tons of contamination, site restoration, my time, report writing. And then for any tonnage over 15 tons, it's $125 per ton for disposal. So that's ballparks. If you have to pump the slurry to get to the tank because we can't physically reach it with a wheelbarrow or the cement truck, add about $600–700 depending on the situation. If we have to hand dig a tank from underneath a crawl space or underneath a deck or something, you're going to add a little bit of monies too. If we know that the tank is underneath a deck or difficult access, we're probably going to add $100 or more for our physical discomfort and labor that's going to be extra from what a normal inspection would be. Okay.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
And we like for somebody to be on site when we do the inspection. I'm usually the bearer of bad news, and I don't want to have to place somebody in the position where they have to trust me that I'm saying what's really there. I would like a new set of eyes to see that. So I'd like to have the buyer there or the seller there or their agent. It's not absolutely necessary, but I encourage somebody to be there. They can kind of see what we're doing, why we're doing it, and what train of thought we're thinking of as we're doing our inspection and what options are available. It's a good learning experience to see the inspection being performed. But it's not necessary that y'all have to be there, but I encourage you to be there.
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah.
Anybody else?
I'm going to be
have-
telling somebody they got an expensive problem most of the time.
Right.
And that's never a popular thing to do to somebody, but those problems are there. And it's best to have them identified prior to somebody buying into it. Nobody will be happy then.
No.
So,
All right,
it's
we
good
just
to-
want to say thank you very much. It was a very, very good class.
Thank you. I appreciate the time and the opportunity to speak to y'all. And again, call me in the future with any questions or concerns, and we'll be happy to talk with you.
We really, really appreciate it. Before everybody jumps off, we have two vendors that may want to take a minute to say something. Bob, I appreciate you and Josiah getting this set for us and the presentation. It's very useful and I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Y'all have a great day.
You too. Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Matthew, I know you're on there.
Hey, Melissa, how are you?
I'm good.
So you can imagine ensuring underground storage tanks or properties where they exist can be a problem. We have various partners that insure those, so we do have outlets for that. I want to share that with you guys. And as Bob mentioned, it's important to obviously keep everything ahead of us and up front. And I will add, with no doubt, that it's important to be of the presence of this. We see cases where clients say there's no underground oil tank present, and then there actually turns out to be. And so just like another thing we're seeing is people that are buying second homes, and it's not so much a problem in the immediate market around the offices, but especially in other areas of the state, the mountains and the coast. We're seeing clients that say, Matthew, we're buying a second home. And in reality, this is not a second home at all. It's a home where their friend or normally family may live. And that's a great reminder to be communicative and upfront, because just like an attorney, they need to know all the factors so they can help. We do the same thing. We need to know the whole thing so we can do what's best and right for you and make sure above all that you're protected, because all day long, if you get the right type of policy, that protects you, that's the point. If you buy a policy that's under not the whole story and it's less expensive, but it doesn't potentially cover you, then you've lost on both counts. So definitely want to mention that. And as always, guys, I'm here to help you 7 days a week until 10 o'clock. I'll add one little component. If your client says to you, I'm coming from, across town, I'm maybe coming across the state or even from out of state, and I have somebody for insurance, guys, just ask them the question, would you pay $50 more a month to go with them? And if they say no, then guys, that client has just opened up an opportunity for you to connect with us. And then that gives you a chance just to shoot us an introductory text, open the dialogue, and that will make you, will surprise you how often that gives you opportunity to connect. So that's all I have for today, guys. Thanks so much. As always, did anybody have any quick questions about roof age as well? That's something that's been a trending topic as of late. Roof ages over 20 years of age can pose a problem. In fact, will likely pose a problem in your transaction. So even if the roof is rated for 30 years, the roof's over 20, you probably have a issue to address as well there. So anyway, any other questions you guys have, comments?
I guess we're good.
All right, perfect. Well, I'll pop my information in chat, just make sure everybody has it. And until next time, guys, I'll catch you later.
Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
We have Miss Nicole with HWA. You want to jump in?
Hey, you guys, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me. That was quite an informational meeting. I appreciate it. I just wanted to let you know, I just posted in the Facebook group page not too long ago. I am absolutely here to support your business. I know that it's incredibly hard to ask for those warranties on the contract like it used to be, because the sellers, I mean, they're really discriminatory now. They're not paying for those things. So, I'm sorry, my little one's trying to give me a phone. But anyway, I'm here to support your business. Just a couple high notes. I can add the home warranty up to 30 days after closing. So if you've got anybody that's already closed, please let me know. And another thing is that feel free to have your buyers call me directly. Don't feel like you need to explain what we cover, how we cover it. Just give them my information. That's all I ask you do, because really the home warranty now, I consider it budget protection. You've got your home buyers paying over asking for these houses, and they really just can't afford replacements. I mean, just to give you an example, I had a call Monday on a claim where they closed Friday, and Saturday on move-in day, the refrigerator's leaking. So, and we see that every day, all day. I would say that as a whole, as a company, we see the majority of our claims come in the first 30 days of ownership. So I just want you to know, again, I'm here to support your business. Please give out my contact information to your buyers. Let them call me. I will go over everything and they can decide if they want the home warranty or not. Leave it up to them. So if do you guys have any questions while I've got you here? Okay, well, you've
Sounds like
got
we're
my
good.
number. And I'll put my number in the chat again, so everybody's got it. But thank you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
All right, I think we are good. Everybody's got our vendor information. I appreciate everybody joining. And we've got this recorded, so as soon as we can, we will get it up on our YouTube. So Nicole, do you have that? You said you were gonna put your information in the chat. Oh, there it is. All right. There's Nicole's information, and I hope everybody has a good day.